I want to share a short testimony with you guys of the power of prayer. About 2 months ago, I literally started praying that the Lord would bring someone to this congregation who did spoken word. And I don't know if you've ever experienced spoken word like we experienced this morning, but I literally was praying for that. And a month ago, I'm at a dinner for leaders, and I meet Aaron, and I don't know how we got to talking about it, but basically, we started talking about spoken word, and he said, "Oh, I write spoken word." I said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, "No, I write spoken word. I've done spoken word on my old church." I said, "Well, do you want to do a spoken word for February?" And he's like, "Sure, why not?" So 2 days later, he got me that spoken word. So thank you, Aaron. And I just thank God for answering that prayer. And I hope that you just enjoyed that piece of worship. I think our God is very creative and uses lots of creative mediums for us to worship him corporately and publicly. So just thankful for that. So I just want to read the last part that he actually spoke on. "I will worship you, Lord. Let them rip me off stages, cut all my wages, even trap me in cages. You are the Lord my God. With you nothing can faze us. I adore, revere, and glorify you because your love is better than life. God, my lips will glorify you." And so as we get into this message on worship, I want to first kind of give us a working definition of what worship is. And honestly, I'm actually working on a master's right now in seminary on worship, and I have a bookshelf full of books on worship. You would not believe how many books have been written on worship, and I'm sure there will be more books to come. There is a lot to be said about worship. And so I want to give you just a little tidbit of a definition that we're going to use this morning. And I think we have a slide up for this. So we've got kind of 3 points we want to look at today. The first is worship is praise and adoration of God. Praise and adoration of God. Worship is also a sacrifice of ourselves, and I would contend also of our lives. Worship is a sacrifice of ourselves and our lives. And lastly, at the heart of worship is communing with God in his presence. Communing with God in his presence. And we're gonna get to in a moment the different ways that we express that worship. But for right now, I just want us to sit in that last piece of the definition here, to commune with God in his presence. Now, to commune means to be in intimate communication with, in the presence of the object of our worship. And obviously the object of our worship we're talking about this morning is the holy and true God who created us and created the earth and everything in the earth. And so to be in intimate communication with and present with the object of our worship. So I want us to take it back to Genesis. You guys are probably mostly familiar with the story in Genesis of Adam and Eve, right? So I want you to picture this. We've got Adam and Eve. They're in the Garden of Eden. This is like paradise. Like, think of like the most amazing place you've ever maybe vacationed to. And if you haven't vacationed to an amazing place outside of New York, go. You should definitely go. But think of like just paradise. I think of like my husband and I went to our honeymoon on Hawaii, and I think of like Hawaii and like the flowers and the birds. I mean, just like think paradise. Like Adam and Eve are literally in this paradise Garden of Eden. And the cool thing is they are communing with God. They are in intimate communication with and in intimate presence of the God that created them. So everything's going great. They're in paradise. They're eating, they're drinking, they're hanging out with God. Everything is great. But then we have a problem, don't we? So what happens? What happens? Somebody shout it out. What happens? What's the problem that happens in paradise? Sin. Yes, sin happens. We call that the fall, right? So we have sin entering into this paradise, this perfect communion that Adam and Eve have with God, right? And the sin totally ruptures that immediate access that they had to God's presence because of their sin. So this intimate communication with their Holy Father, their Creator, is broken. It's broken. And now they're worried about what? They're worried about their nakedness. They're worried about their vulnerability. They literally are having to cover themselves up, literally, right? So there's this worry, and again, this intimacy has been broken. This intimate presence with Lord has been broken. And their whole being with everything has now changed. So they went from this paradise, this beautiful, intimate presence and communion with God, into this changed and broken worship. And unfortunately, that change not just affected them, but it affected all of humankind. So their worship was broken. Now, there is good news in this story, because what I want to tell you this morning, what we're going to focus on this morning, is the fact that despite the sin, despite the fall, despite the brokenness, God still wanted to be with his people. His love was so deep for his people, his creation, that he still wanted to find a way to be with them. And so even though their immediate access to God was broken, God provides a way for his people to have a mediated access to continue to commune with himself. He still wants those whom he loves to be in communion and worship with him. And what is amazing to me in the Old Testament, and I got to tell you guys, if you've never read the Bible chronologically, I encourage you to do this. There's all kinds of chronological Bibles out there. But for me, the Old Testament really came alive when I read it chronologically. And all of a sudden, the story arc, because, some of those books in there are very confusing, right? We've got numbers and lots of instructions. But this is the really cool thing. When you start to read these instructions in their context, you start to see that God had this whole plan to create a place where his presence could dwell for his people again. And he gave them very specific instructions on how they could worship him again. Okay? So all throughout the Testament, we see how specific God's instructions were. If we jump ahead, we start with Moses. We see where God, tells him to build a tabernacle. And the word tabernacle literally means dwelling place. And so this is where God's presence could now dwell, is in this tabernacle. And he gave Moses very specific instructions on how to build this tabernacle. And then we have David and Solomon, right? You remember the stories of where God instructs them on how to build the temple that will replace the tabernacle, again, where the presence of God will dwell with his people. And both of these things were to be built very specifically as it related to the architecture, the type of materials. There was a lot of craft and care and thought that the Lord put into how the place where his dwelling would look, what was in it, things that would be included in it. In fact, he also gave us very specific instructions in the Old Testament for the Israelites of how they were to enter into worship, into the tabernacle, into the temple. Now, it's really cool that this message I'm giving actually dovetails really well with this book that my creative artist group, my home group on Thursday nights, we are reading a book together called How to Worship a King. It's by a guy named Zach Neese, and it's so cool because this guy literally devotes almost a chapter apiece to all of the different things that are in the temple, in the tabernacle, and the importance of them, what they symbolize. So he has a chapter on the altar. He has a chapter on the laver, which was used by the priest back then in those days for the purification of sin. They would use the laver. The table of showbread, the golden lampstand, all these things the Lord instructed to be in the temple and the tabernacle. The altar of incense, which symbolized the prayers of God's people. We sang about incense rising this morning, right? The prayers of God's people rising to him. The Ark of the Covenant. Most of you know, like, Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? We all know that movie, right? What happens at the end there, right? When they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant and how they're not to touch it, right? Because of God's glory. We all know what happens there. It contained God's powerful presence. The outer courts. We have the outer courts, which is where the priest, would make their sacrifice and the purification of their sins. They would bring the sacrifice, the animals and the blood sacrifices there. And then we have the Holy of Holies, right? So the Holy of Holies is this area in the tabernacle, in the temple, where only the priest could enter. And once a year on the Day of Atonement is when those priests could enter. And there was a veil or curtain, if you will, a very thick curtain that would separate that Holy of Holy place. And so, the average Israelite was not allowed to go in there, but the priest would go in there instead, this mediated access to God's presence. So we also, if we go back to our definition here, as we're talking about the outer courts and the sacrifice that was needed, we mentioned that worship is also defined by sacrifice. And in order to have that mediated access to God, to commune with God, a sacrifice was needed. And why was the sacrifice needed? Well, it's because God was holy and powerful and glorious. And man was not. because of our sin. And we have examples in the Old Testament of God's power and his glory. You remember Moses in the burning bush, right? I think we have a slide depicting this, right? So Moses in Exodus 3, he sees this bush on fire, but it's not burning up. I don't know about you, but that would freak me out if I'm standing there and I'm looking at this bush, right? And it is on fire, and it is on fire, and it is on fire, and it's not burning up. It is God. And what does the Lord say? He says, don't come any closer. You are on holy ground. Then in Exodus 24:17, we have, again, I think we have a picture of this, right? So we have the Israelites at the base of the mountain and God's presence on the top of Mount Sinai. And what does it say? He looks like a consuming fire. So his power, his glory, fire. Looks like fire, right? And so leading up to this in Exodus 24, all throughout Exodus 23 and 20, actually chapters 20 through 23 is where Moses is hearing from God, right? This is where we get our 10 commandments. This is where we get the laws. So the Lord is communicating to Moses, how the people of God should live, what laws they should live by. And just like Jesus, that was Moses' role, to hear from the Lord, hear what those instructions were, hear what the law was, and then to communicate that to God's people, the Israelites. And Moses was also allowed special access to God's presence, right? We know this, that the others were not. And that leads us to our passage that you heard Hope read this morning. I'm going to read it again for you. So in Exodus 24, we're on verse 1 and 2. Then the Lord said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance. But Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The others must not come near, and the people may not come up with him. And so we see in this passage, right, that in Exodus 24, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, plus the 70 elders, they're all invited, but there are two notable things about this passage that really stood out to me that I want us to look at today. And the first is, before they came near to the Lord, they were instructed to what? Worship. So as they're beginning to enter into the presence of the Lord, they are instructed to worship first. And we have a lot of scripture that it gives us instruction on how to worship and how we worship first as we are entering into God's presence. And we do this. I love the Psalms. The Psalms are a great place to hang out. If you're looking for a book in the Bible to learn worship, it's all about worship. The Psalms are all about worshiping God. We have in Psalm 104 says, enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. Psalm 2:11 says, worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. I thought about this verse in Exodus, and I thought, gosh, if it were me and I were down at the bottom of that mountain, I would probably be, kind of rejoicing with a little bit of trembling, looking at the fire of the presence of God, right? So we have this reverence exemplified here. And Psalm 116:17 says, to you I shall offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving and call upon the name of the Lord. And these are just a few. These are just a few Psalms where we see this entering into God's courts with thanksgiving, with praise, with adoration, and with sacrifice. With sacrifice. And so we're to do so praising God, adoring him for who he is, what he's done in our lives. Reverently, there's a reverence about remembering that he is still holy. He's still a holy and powerful and glorious God. So there's a reverence that with which we come to him. Rejoicingly, we rejoice for the things that he's done and offering up thanksgiving for who God is as well. And so this made me think about when I put a worship set together. I don't know if you guys have kind of noticed this, but on Sundays, that first song that we sing, typically when I'm thinking through a set, I want that first song to be praise and adoration of who God is and what his attributes are. And I'm going to give you a pop quiz for those of you who were here last week. Does anybody remember what the first song the choir sang last week was? Shout it out. Anybody remember? What did the choir sing last week? You are good. Lord, you are good. We have one person that remembered, right? So, Lord, you are good. Lord, you are good. That's how we want to enter into his presence in our worship. Lord, you are good. And I acknowledge that on some days when we come in here, and I'm sure the Israelites felt this too, that there were days that they did not feel that the Lord was good. But we have a promise in Scripture that regardless of whether our feelings change, our circumstances change, we may be going through a deep valley of suffering, of pain, of things that inhibit us from saying, Lord, you are good. I want to encourage you this morning. The Scripture says that the Lord does not change. His love is unchangeable. His grace is unchangeable. His forgiveness for us is unchangeable. So though our circumstances are going to change and our feelings are going to change, the Lord does not change. And that's what allows us in those circumstances and situations to still say, Lord, I know you are good, even if I don't feel it. So the second thing that we notice in Exodus 24:1 is this phrase, you are to worship at a distance. And I got to tell you guys, this was the verse that stood out to me when I was reading through this and preparing for this message. I started, literally, I don't think honestly I'd ever read that. I'd read this passage before, and I've obviously read, 10 Commandments. We all read that, and we, read where they're at the bottom of the mountain. They're looking up, and, they're going to go up to the Lord and this, but you are to worship at a distance. Really hit me like a ton of bricks. And I started trying to put myself in the headspace of the Israelites. Like, if I had been there, like, would that have bothered me? That I was told, I need to worship at a distance. Would I have been scared? Would I have been jealous of Moses? That Moses got to go up, but I didn't get to go up? I thought about this. I was like, yeah, I might have been jealous of Moses. Why does Moses get to go up and I don't get to go up, right? So this idea that, the Israelites, the elders even, were down there at the base of the mountain told to worship at a distance. And I started thinking too, like, did they think that God, because of this, was this sort of very distant entity that they couldn't engage with? And as I thought about that, I thought about my own story. And so I was raised in a church-going home where we would go to church every Sunday. We sang hymns to God. We prayed to God. We read scripture. But the God that they talked about seemed so distant to me. He just seemed like this, like, bizarre spiritual entity, like up in the sky that we sang and we prayed to. But I had no connection. I had no understanding of who he was in my life. And in addition to that, when I was growing up and I was a kid, I had another object in my own life that I worshiped, that I basically, it took my whole life over. I was obsessed. It was my passion. And it honestly was my object of worship, and it was dance. And I think I'm going to embarrass myself here because at Christmas, I was at home, and I was going through some old photos because my mom was making me because they're clearing out their house. And I was coming across all these photos of me. I think this is the one. Yeah, I'm going to really embarrass myself. So this is me, like, in elementary school before a dance recital. I've got, like, way too much blush on my face and a little tiara. I think we have another one, too. We have another more poised one. So this is me in a ballet company. So basically from the age of preschool all the way up through middle school, I danced. That's all I did. I was obsessed with it. It was my passion. I had every, like, Baryshnikov poster in my room. You guys probably don't even know who Baryshnikov is anymore, but he was like this really famous, ballet dancer from Russia. And so I was obsessed. So when I was not at school, I was at the dance studio training. If I was not at the dance studio training or I was not home doing homework, I was in the basement where my dad had upfitted this little, like, dance rehearsal room for me. He put, like, this Marley floor down and this ballet bar and mirrors and the whole deal. And I had my jam box down there, and I just would dance. Like, that's all I wanted to do. That's all I cared about was dance. And so I can truly say, like, that was the object of my worship growing up as a kid, because this God, I didn't understand who this God was, right? So, but truth be told, as I look back, I'm able to look at that and see that a lot of the reason that I threw myself into that I threw myself into worshiping that, was because it was an escape. I was raised in a fairly dysfunctional family, like we all are. There was a lot of fighting that went on in my family. And honestly, it was way easier for me to go down in that basement and turn on my classical music and throw myself into that than have to deal with the fighting. So at any rate, when I was 16, my dad got a job change, and we had to move. I was 16, mind you. Terrible time to move when you're 16. And we moved from the East Coast to the Midwest, which I affectionately called cow country, because I literally thought there was nothing else in Missouri but cows. And I was pretty sure there would be no dance companies for me to get involved in, and there weren't. And so here I am. I'm, in the middle of Missouri, having to start school, new school, in high school, and I was devastated. The object of my worship was stripped away from me. And as painful as that was, I can honestly tell you, now looking back decades later, it was the best thing that God could have ever done in my life. Because when that got stripped away, that opened up my life to allow people to come into my life. And there were people at my school. There was a church we got involved in, people that knew Jesus personally. And I was able to understand that this distant God that I had no connection to actually could be a very personal God through Jesus and through having a relationship with Jesus. So I want to remind us this morning that sometimes it takes some stripping away for us to come back to the one true object of our worship that will always satisfy and that will give us abundant life. And so as painful as it was, like I said, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I started a relationship with Jesus when I was in high school there, and I realized that God was not distant at all, but he was very, very close. So remember how we said earlier that in the Old Testament, despite the fall, despite our sin, that God provided a way, a mediated way for us to be able to commune with him, right? So Moses foreshadowed this great mediator who is Jesus, God's son, sacrificed on our behalf so that we could have immediate access to him and very close and present communion with him. And in the tabernacle, as I mentioned, there was this veil, right, that used to separate the people from where God's presence would dwell. And just like the distance that the elders had to keep at the base of that mountain, for generations, God's people were kept apart by that veil from the presence of God. Those who were not holy, those who were not sanctified, were kept somewhat at a distance from God's presence until Jesus came along. And that brings us to our new passage testament out of Matthew 27. And Matthew 27 says of Jesus' death on a cross, and when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. And the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. So not only was Jesus' death on the cross the sacrifice for our sin, but it also tore that veil that separated us from God's presence. And his death and resurrection removed that distance, right, that man previously had from that immediate access into God's holy presence. So when we have Jesus, we no longer worship God from a distance. We are actually entering into his presence very closely and very personally and very presently, because he made a way for us to do that in his son. So given that fact that God, in his amazing love and grace and desire to be with his people intimately, he had a plan, right? He had a very specific plan in the Old Testament, foreshadowing the plan of Jesus to be that great mediator for us. So I want us to kind of think about, now that we have this, right? We have this truth. How do we express our worship? How do we express that? What the Lord has done for us? Because he loved us so much that he didn't even let sin separate us from him. So I've jotted down a few words that I want us to think about this morning, and these are just a couple things. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but there's some things I want us to think about. And these are ways that we see people all throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, worship God through their posture and their practice. So I think we've got this up here. Yeah, so the first one is expressively. Expressively. What does it look like to worship God expressively? And I want us to think about these things not just in the context of, here on Sunday, right? We're here on Sunday together. We're corporately worshiping together. We can be expressive in our worship together. But what would that look like for you to worship the Lord throughout your week expressively? And again, worship is not defined by just music. Worship is not defined by just singing. We worship with our whole life. Our whole life is an offering of worship, or can be, if we choose to let it be, an offering to the Lord. So what does that look like to do that expressively? Joyfully. We already talked about, coming before the Lord in praise and adoration for all that he has done for us and all that he will do as we continue to walk with him in our purpose and in our calling. So joyfully, we come before him joyfully with a spirit of joy. Even, as we said, in those moments when we don't feel joyful, we're still able to say, Lord, I know you are still good. You have proved yourself. You are still good. Reverently. We talked about the reverence of God's holiness, right? We're bridged to him now. We have this immediate access through Jesus to come before him in intimate communion, but we still do so with a reverence for his holiness. He is God. We are not. We are not God. He created the heavens, the earth. He created us very specifically. And so there's a holiness there. There's a reverence, a respect that we come to him with in our worship. Publicly. We're here publicly worshiping. And I don't know about you, but I am so thankful. There are countries where you cannot publicly worship the Lord. And we're not in one of them. We are freely able to publicly worship our God in whatever way the Lord would have us worship him. So publicly. But what does that also mean publicly outside these walls? So something to think about. What does that look like to be public in our worship? Wildly. It's kind of a wild word, isn't it? Wildly. Right? What would that look like? I don't have an answer for that one. I leave that with you guys to think about. What does it look like to worship the Lord wildly? I think of just abandonedly, with a sense of abandonment. Wildly. What does that look like to worship him? Humbly. Again, we come before him as humble servants, just as our model of Jesus. Jesus was our suffering servant, our humble servant who died on a cross. We come before him with humble hearts too, because we don't have it all together, do we? We don't have it all together. So we come with a humility. Lord, we exalt you, not ourselves. So what does that look like to worship him humbly? Loudly. One of my favorite things when I'm worship leading up here is when I hear you guys singing. I can hear what's going on up here, but the thing that makes a great worship service for me is when I hear you guys singing to the Lord. When I hear your voices going up in unison, you have no idea what that does for my heart, because I feel that I'm part of a bigger community and worship, and I'm not alone. So worshiping him loudly with our voices is a great way to come before him. And then quietly, maybe in your private worship at home. I know for me, my husband will tell you, one of the hardest things for us when we moved back to New York a year and a half ago, we had been on a farm in Georgia, like a very quiet farm. And we had this great porch. And I used to sit out on the porch and I'd take my Bible out there, my coffee, and it was just quiet. All I heard was birds chirping and leaves rustling, and I could just feel God's presence because it was quiet and I was able to just be still and there was nothing distracting me. And that's been a hard thing about living in New York, is to find those places where I can worship the Lord quietly. It can be done. Sometimes you have to get up really early in the morning before the city is even awake to do it. If you're near a park, maybe going to a park and worshiping the Lord in a park where it's quiet in the morning or in the evening time, but finding a space to worship him quietly. And I'll tell you what comes from that. When we worship the Lord quietly, when we are in intimate communion and communication with him quietly, oftentimes we're able to hear him more clearly. That's just what it's been like for me. So finding those spaces where we can worship him quietly. Authentically, we've got to be real. We've got to be real before the Lord. The Lord knows everything we're thinking, feeling. We know the verse, he knows all the hairs on our head. He absolutely knows everything about you. So to come before him and worship with any kind of false pretense, not only does it not honor him, but there's a barrier there, right? When we're not real. Think about any other relationship you have in your life where you're not able to be authentic with that person. It feels like there's kind of a wall there, right? Like you feel like you've got this front up. I feel like that's what it's like when we're not authentic with the Lord. He just wants us to be real. And again, we may be feeling like, God, you feel I'm distant. Like you're distant right now. I'm not experiencing you. I don't feel your presence. That's okay to be honest with him about that. He wants our honesty. He wants our honesty. And then lastly, with our whole being. So this idea of us worshiping with our minds, our spirit, and our whole body. We have examples of this, again, in the Bible, of God's people. We can see how they worship with their whole body. And we have a couple of these. We'll throw up this slide now, what this would look like. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the ways that we see God's people worshiping him in spirit and truth. So dancing. It's funny now because I shared with you guys in my testimony about how, I kind of use dance as an escape. I also feel like the Lord gave that to me as a gift of a way that I could then turn and make him the object of my worship and express with him. So oftentimes you see I can't sit still. When I'm worshiping, I'm often moving, even if I'm just shifting side to side, because that movement is in me. So when I'm worshiping God with my whole body, that might come out looking like some dancing going on upstage, or even at home. If I'm in my quiet time and I decide to get up and listen to some good worship music, I might dance with the Lord. But conversely, bowing, right? So that this idea of our reverence, our humility before him, and taking a bowing posture. We see this all throughout the Old Testament. Many of our high churches, if you've ever been in a high church, like an Episcopalian church, they have the benches that pull out, right? So this idea of we kneel before him in reverence and acknowledge him for who he is. Shouting, and conversely kneeling. So bowing and kneeling, shouting and dancing. So those are two kind of opposite extremes, right? But we can worship the Lord through all of those ways. Rejoicing and trembling. We talked about, when the Israelites and the elders are down at the base of the mountain and they're looking up, I think there had to have been some rejoicing and trembling, right? Sort of this awestruck, wow, of who the Lord is and his power that he carries, and conversely we carry as well with us because we've got the Holy Spirit in us. So that power, that rejoicing and trembling at the same time. Singing in silence. Even if you don't, this is what I want to encourage you guys. You may not think you have the best voice. God doesn't care about that. God just wants to know that you love him. And so expressing our love to him in song, through spiritual songs, we're just giving back to our Father. That's what we're doing. We're giving back to our Father with our voices. And then conversely, silence. I talked about that idea of silencing ourselves before him. One of the things I've been challenging our artist group to do, they had a little homework this week, was to spend some time in solitude this week. And that's a hard thing to do. Has anybody, just by show of hands, has anybody ever tried solitude? Like true solitude? Just like, yeah, a few of you. It's hard, right? It's hard. I remember the first time I tried it, I was reading a book written by Henry Nouwen about the importance of solitude and sort of how to just still and quiet your mind. And I went out on that same porch in Georgia, and I'm out there, and I'm like, oh, this will be so easy. Like, it's quiet out here. I can have solitude, no problem. And I'm sitting there, and I'm like, and thoughts start coming into your mind. You start thinking about things like, oh, I got to be thinking about this for tomorrow, and oh, I got to like make lunch for my son, and all of a sudden you think you're in solitude, and then like these thoughts coming in, and we are bombarded. We are bombarded. So it's really hard sometimes to worship the Lord in our silence. But I would encourage you, it's a great discipline. Even if you do it once or twice a week, it's a great discipline. And again, the Lord, it creates some space for the Lord to speak to us in a way that we wouldn't be able to hear him necessarily otherwise. So singing and conversely silence. Hands outstretched and then faces up planted on the ground. I was thinking about this when I was thinking about hands outstretched. I was thinking like the churches that I had worshiped in and worship led in, like in the early time in my 20s and 30s, were a little more reverent in nature, and there was no outstretching of hands, except this one guy in our service. I remember I would kind of sit behind him. My husband and I would sit behind him, and I remember this one guy, like he'd be down in like the third row. And he is like this. I mean, he's got his both hands raised in the air, and he's swaying. And I remember, like, at first, when I first started going to that church, I was like, who is that guy? Like, what is he doing? It's just, I'd never seen it before. But I'm like, he's really into that. Like, he's really into the worship, and he's singing at the top of his lungs. And, and again, his hands are just, like, way up in the air. And I'm like, and I remember the first couple times I was, like, looking around, like, wondering, like, I wonder if anyone else thinks this is kind of weird, or, like, what, is this weirding people out at all? I'm like, why is he doing that? And then, as the weeks would go on, right, and I'm there, and the Lord's getting a hold of me, and I'm singing, and the Lord's really speaking to me through these services, through the songs, and through the preaching, I started looking at this guy a lot differently, and I started thinking, I want what he's got. Like, I want to be that, like, what is the word? Non-self-conscious, right? Because I literally was thinking, like, oh, well, what will people think of me if I raise my hands in complete abandonment and surrender in worshiping God? What will people think of me? Will they think I'm weird? Because that's what I thought of him. And then eventually I got over myself, right? And the Lord started speaking to me, Cathy, you don't need to be worrying about what other people are thinking right now, because this is me and you right here. This is an audience of one. You're worshiping me. And you need to do it in abandonment. So I share that because that might speak to somebody this morning. That might speak to somebody who's been a little worried about raising your hands or thinking it's weird. But again, it's this abandonment of, Lord, you are good, and I want to give you my whole being, including my hands, Lord. I want to glorify you and worship you with every part of my being, including my hands. It's not weird. It's worship. So, conversely, faces on the ground. Again, this idea of bowing, kneeling, planting our faces. I've had times in my life when things have been going really badly. And so sometimes my face is in the ground because, Lord, I don't know how to worship you. I don't know what to say. I have no words. I have no song in my mouth. And so all I can do is plant my face on the ground because I know that you're still there, and I know that you still love me, and I know that I'm still supposed to worship you, but you've got to give me the words because I don't have them. So I've had times in my life when my face has been on the ground in despair and pain, trying to worship. And then I've also had times in my life where the Lord has come through in a way that I never thought, and maybe somebody else can testify this, but a way that you never thought the Lord would come through. And you just can't believe it. And your face is on the ground because you know nobody else could have done that thing except for God. And therefore, he deserves all of us. He deserves all of me, my whole body, my whole being, my whole self, because of his goodness. So clapping hands, raising heads. We've been doing a little more hand clapping here at Hope Midtown. I hope that's okay. Again, I think we can make a joyful noise, right? You guys don't have instruments out there like we do on stage, but guess what? You've got a percussion right here in your hands. So whether we're singing or we're making percussive noises to the Lord with our hands, clapping hands, raising our heads to the Lord. These are all ways that we can express our worship. So I want to leave you with a couple questions today, and these are not easy questions, but I want you to think about this, because I want you to be able to, it's all fine and well if I'm up here and I talk to you about worship, and you're like, oh yeah, Cathy, that makes sense. But if it doesn't affect you and it doesn't change how you worship, then I've not done my job. So I want you to think first about, how is your worship going? And I don't mean just here. I mean, how is your worship going throughout your week? How is your praise and adoration of God going? How is your offering a sacrifice of thanksgiving going to the Lord? Are you doing that just on Sundays? Are you doing that throughout your week? Are you aware of that immediate access you have to God? Or are you still worshiping at a distance? And I promise you, he is not distant. He is there. But we put the barriers up. Are there idols? Are there idols in your life right now that you're worshiping in place of worshiping God? These are things to be thinking about. And ask the Lord. Because maybe you don't know. Maybe you're not even aware of it. Maybe you're not aware that relationship in your life has become an idol of worship and has caused a barrier between you and God. So ask him. Maybe that job, maybe the hope of that job, trying to get that new job, right? Maybe that's become an idol of worship, and that's interfering. I want to remind you, you have direct and immediate access to God through Jesus at all times, all times. And then secondly, how is your expression of worship? So we talked about a bunch of different ways that we express our worship, right? So my question to you is kind of piggybacking off of the series that Drew's had us in of All In. Are you all in with your worship? Are you all in? Or are there parts that you've been withholding from God? Because you're afraid? You're afraid of rejection? You're worried about what other people are going to think about how you worship? Are you all in? And if you're not, you need to ask the Lord, what do I need to do to be all in? What do I need to do to be all in with my worship? And I think another thing that can get in the way of our expression to worship, or even just our worship in general, is, like I said, if we are still operating in our relationship with the Lord as if he is this distant entity. And maybe you're here today and no one's ever introduced you to Jesus. No one's ever introduced you or talked to you about Jesus, God's Son, as the great mediator who tore the veil. Tore the veil. No more veil. No more distance. And how that relationship with Jesus is what gains us that direct and personal communion and communication and presence with the one true living God.